Now, I have the great pleasure to invite you, Dr. Jessica Zucker, to come to the stage. So, we are very glad to have you here. It's an honor to have you as a first international speaker on this symposium. We are on the 19th edition, and you are the first international speaker to be invited to address the Brazilian audience. And we are very proud, and thank you so much for coming to make this long trip from London to São Paulo to stay with us today. And you have the floor for about 40 minutes for your presentation. Muito obrigado.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much. Wow, what an honor it is to be here. Thank you so much to the Brazilian Information and Network Coordination Center and to the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee for the invitation to be here. I didn't realize I was the first ever foreigner to be joining. That's an unbelievable honor. Well, I will start by welcoming you all to the 9th Symposium for Children and Adolescents on the Internet. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today. It is a pivotal moment in internet regulation, not just from the UK and Europe, but also hopefully across Latin America as well. I truly believe that as an international community, if we come together to think about how we can share experiences, share our learnings and our expertise, we can come together and solve some of the world's most pressing societal problems, as the ones that we're going to discuss today are. My name is Jessica Zucker, and I am Director of Online Safety Policy at Ofcom. Let's see. Okay, it works. Ofcom is the United Kingdom's independent communications regulator. We are also the new implementing body for the new rules for online safety in the UK, which I'll refer to as the Online Safety Act. We are independent from government, which is a slightly different setup for most regulators. This means that we are not part of the government, but we are empowered with the powers from Parliament in the laws that they have passed to us, which allows us a degree of independence as well as continuity as election cycles change different political leaders across our country. We have experience regulating communication sectors for the last 20 years. As you can see from the slide here, these are some of the sectors that we have experience regulating in: communications systems like radio, spectrum, broadcast TV, postal, and really excitingly, we are now the new regulators for online safety. The powers that we've been given were passed in Parliament at the end of last year in response to the challenges around online safety, which we've already heard a little bit about today. These powers are wide-ranging, they're novel, they're new, and in essence, they require that tech platforms prevent harm from users using their platforms. And this includes illegal harms, such as things like child sexual abuse material, which we spoke about earlier, fraud, foreign interference, intimate image abuse sharing, violence and incitement, and terrorism, but it also includes protections to children, so things such as content that may promote eating disorders or suicide and self-injury, as well as pornography. So given the audience that we have here today and the discussions that will be taking place throughout the rest of the day, I wanted to do 4 things. First, I wanted to share a little bit more about the Online Safety Act, as I know that this is really important and live in the discussions here in Brazil in the current regulatory environment. Second, I'll share a little bit more about what my team at Ofcom is doing to prepare for these new rules, what our focus is, and what outcomes we hope to achieve. Third, I'll share a little bit more about the learnings that we've taken so far from our experience in regulating these sectors, as well as the work that we've been doing to build evidence and research. And then finally, and very relevant for this audience, I want to share a little bit more about the importance of international and domestic regulatory cooperation. But first, before I start with the Online Safety Act, I always think it's important to set some context about the current challenges that we face. I think there's no doubt in this room that digital technologies have absolutely revolutionized our worlds, from the individual experiences to societies to businesses to our culture. There's been brought tremendous benefit to our lives. But we also know that that has not come without challenge, and the challenges are enormous. So according to research that my team at Ofcom has produced, we know that in the UK, adults have experienced 68% of adults have experienced some form of online harm in the last 4 weeks, which is an astounding number. 36% of those users have direct experience with online fraud, and even more worrying, as many as 1 in 5 children have been the victims of targeted grooming attempts. These are really worrisome numbers, but I think to really understand the scale of the challenge, we have to dig into this even more. So what these numbers tell us first is that we know that harms can impact a really wide range of people across society. We also know that they have disproportionate impacts on people from marginalized communities, such as ethnic minorities, women, as well as children. The second thing that these statistics tell us is that online harms don't always stay online. In fact, they can often follow people into their offline worlds. I think this is particularly the case with harms such as grooming, where we know that the psychological implications can follow people throughout their lives and have really devastating impacts. The third thing that we know is that these types of harms can occur on a really wide range of different types of services, not just the biggest services, but also the smallest ones. And it's not just social media, but also gaming, messaging, dating, search platforms, file sharing platforms. It's not unique to only one type of company. And the last thing that is most interesting about this is that the types of functionalities that bring benefit to users can also be the things that increase the most risk. So for example, take encryption. Encryption is a really useful tool for data security and data protection, but it also can be a way for criminals to evade detection. Similarly, recommender algorithms are very useful in serving content to users that are really beneficial to them. But also, if you're already in a rabbit hole of looking at harmful content, it can continue to make that rabbit hole even worse. So what these stats tell us is that there's a really clear and pressing challenge that we need to address, but we must do so in a carefully balanced way that ensures that we are protecting users from harm online, but also doing so in a way that upholds fundamental human rights, such as freedom of expression, as well as protecting a vibrant digital economy. So with that context, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you all about the Online Safety Act, as I know that this is an important model by which many in Brazil are looking to in terms of their own forms of online safety regulation. So in short, the Online Safety Act, which are the new rules governing online platforms in the UK, were passed at the end of last year. They require companies to put in place systems and processes to protect users from the spread of illegal content, such as the ones I've mentioned, as well as to protect children from harms that they may experience online. It's a rules-based and risk-based system in which platforms will need to conduct risk assessments, looking at their unique functionalities, their unique user base, and then look at corresponding mitigations to address those risks, which means it is proportionate, it is risk-based. These rules apply to user-to-user platforms as well as search services that operate in the UK. They don't necessarily need to be headquartered in the UK, so this means that it reaches over 100,000 companies around the world. The Act really seeks to establish clear rules for platforms and what they have to do, but it also embeds proportionality into its ethos. What this means in practice is when my team says that a company needs to do a certain thing to mitigate against a certain harm, we must do really robust impact assessments to understand what is the impact of that recommendation, what is the cost to the business, what is the implications on freedom of expression, on privacy, or other fundamental human rights. This act is enormous, it is complex, it covers so many different types of harms, and so we've decided to take a 3-stage approach to how we are approaching our implementation. And we're starting with the most egregious and most severe harms that are illegal under UK law. So the first phase of our regulation is the focus on illegal harms. So I mentioned the Act passed in October 2023 last year. As soon as the Act passed, we followed that with our first set of proposals for how we think that platforms should protect people against illegal harms. We published our draft proposals, a whopping 1,700 pages of material about online harms and how they manifest and the things platforms should do to address those harms. We had this open for consultation and invited a range of response from anyone around the world. Our team has been really hard at work reviewing those proposals and thinking about how to adapt our draft recommendations. And I'm excited to share that we plan to publish our final set of recommendations at the end of this year. Once we do that, the UK Parliament must then approve those recommendations, and then from there they will be enforced into law. So we expect by around March of next year that we'll be able to enforce these new rules, and that's really exciting as a first step. The second phase of our regulatory implementation, which is of most interest to this group, is the stage of protecting children from harms online. So this might include things that are legal under UK law, but might still have potential to harm children and adolescents. I mentioned a few of these, so suicide, self-injury, eating disorder content, pornography. These are the kinds of things that we are telling platforms that they need to do more in order to protect children against these types of harms. We published our proposals in May of this year, and similarly, we expect that these proposals will go into force by July next year. But excitingly, from already in January, we will have an expectation that pornographic platforms need to put in place age verification to prevent children from accessing them. And those platforms that may have a risk of children accessing them will need to begin to produce access assessments as well as child risk assessments. And then finally, the third phase of regulatory implementation is a set of additional duties for companies that we define as categorized. Many of you may be familiar with the European Union's DSA, in which a subset of regulated platforms are designated as VLOPs. In the UK, we have a similar system in which the largest and riskiest companies will be subject to an additional set of duties. These include things like fraudulent advertising, really excitingly, transparency reporting, new tools to empower users to control the content that they see and who they interact with, as well as additional protections for freedom of expression, including for content that comes from journalists, news publishers, and are important to democratic processes. So there's a lot that we need to do here, and we know that this is going to take quite a lot of time. What we've been trying to do is implement these rules as quickly as possible. In order to do that, we have been spending quite a lot of time over the last several years building up our team. I always love to see people's reactions when I say how many people we have now. But in the last couple of years, we've recruited a team of over 350 people within Ofcom who are all working together to implement these rules. We come from a really wide range of backgrounds. So there's some, like myself, who've come from the tech sector and bring a unique expertise in having done this in practice. We have people who have worked in law enforcement. We have people who've come from children charities. We have economists, lawyers, of course, other regulators. And together we come and we bring our unique set of expertise to apply these rules together. We also know that important to do this is to build up our evidence base in our research. So before the laws pass, we have already conducted huge amounts of research into how online harms manifest, into how people are experiencing things online, into the types of mitigations that platforms can put in place to make change. And this is all really fundamental in informing our regulatory approach. And while these rules aren't yet enforced, what we're telling platforms is that they don't need to wait to start implementing these rules, that they can start acting now. I mentioned before, the Online Safety Act is very large. It tries to accomplish quite a lot of different things, and so we've tried to boil it down into 4 really easy and clear outcomes that we hope that our regulatory rules will achieve. The first is we hope to achieve better governance and risk management across platforms. That means more senior level accountability for online safety decisions and more regular risk assessments, particularly for children. Secondly, we want to see massive improvements in transparency and trust across platforms. We will be using our new transparency powers to shine a light on best practices and poor practices. Third, we want to see companies build safety in by design. So when they are building products, policies, operations, they are thinking about safety from the very beginning to the very end. And lastly, we hope to see more user empowerment and choice. We want users to be able to have more control over their online experiences, including about the content that they see, as well as the type of people that they interact with. Now, taking this down a level even further, we hope to achieve 8 very specific goals in the next 3 years. You can see some of these on the screen right now, which I won't go into depth in its entirety. I will speak in a little bit about some of the specific goals that we have for child safety. But one thing I do want to make clear is that our goal is to make people's lives safer online. We also know that it is impossible to achieve a world online in which there are no online harms. That's because the drivers between these harms and the things that we see occurring online also occur offline. So long as there is hate speech in the real world, there will be some degree of hate speech online. Our goal through a risk-based and rules-based system of regulation is to reduce the risk of harm and to help users be more prepared for the online experiences they have. We're not starting from nothing. We have tremendous amount of learnings to date. One of the ways that we have built up our learnings is through previous rules for online video sharing platforms who are established in the UK, which we've been regulating for the last few years. Some of these actually include the largest companies like TikTok, Snap, Twitch, OnlyFans, and we've learned quite a lot from our regulatory experience with them so far. We've also gained quite a lot of knowledge from producing the huge amount of guidance that the Online Safety Act requires, and that's where I'll go next. The Online Safety Act requires Ofcom to produce something around 40 to 50 regulatory products. So these are guidance or codes of practices that help platforms deliver on these new rules and the responsibilities that they must undertake. At Ofcom, our approach is to take a consultative approach to these. That means that before we tell platforms specifically what they must need to do, we publish these first in a draft form, and we open it up for consultation for anyone to give input. This is incredibly important for us because as a regulator, we have to make very difficult decisions that carefully balance tricky things, user safety on the one hand, vibrant economy and competition, as well as fundamental human rights. And so we think that by publishing our proposals first as draft, we can invite more input, get more experience, and we can learn where we've got things right and where we need to make improvements and change things for the future. So some of the examples of the safety measures that we have proposed that we are considering now solidifying into binding rules are here on the screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics about how we protect children online. So some of the things that we've proposed, particularly to prevent the spread of grooming, is to make children's accounts harder to find and harder to interact with. We've also proposed that children's accounts should not have their location automatically set on by default. We also think that children need to have their own specific and accessible ways to complain and to report content that they see. And finally, we think that children also deserve to have their own tools to control their online experiences, such as being able to decline group invitations, to block or mute users, or to disable comments in their own posts. But in order to be able to protect children, platforms need to be able to understand who their children are in the first place, and this is where we hope to see massive improvements with these new rules. And that is where the importance of things like age assurance come in. You can't protect your users or your children if you don't know who your children are. And so alongside our proposals for how to protect children, we've published a robust set of guidance around how to implement highly effective age assurance. Very important to this, going back to proportionality and human rights, we're not requiring that platforms verify the identity of their children, we're asking them to verify the age. What we hope is that platforms where there is a risk of harm to children, that they will put in place robust forms of age assurance that are highly accurate, they are robust, they're reliable, and they're fair. But how do we get platforms to comply with these rules? That's where supervision and enforcement come in. So supervision is a technique for regulation that some other industries use, particularly financial services. What this means is that regulators work directly one-on-one with some of the regulated platforms in order to have a very close and collaborative relationship. For us, we are going to be supervising some of the largest and riskiest services. We will be working with them very closely to make sure that we understand the risks that they face and the steps that they are taking to address those risks. This helps us ensure that we are promoting compliance to them and that they understand what is required of them. What supervision also allows us to do is to push for change through more informal channels. Through these conversations, we can tell them, we want you to do X, Y, Z, without having to actually use our enforcement powers. Now, going back to what I mentioned before, we've been regulating some video sharing platforms in the UK. As part of this, we've been supervising TikTok, OnlyFans, Snap, and some 20 or so other companies. What we have found through supervision is through these informal conversations, we've actually been able to push for tangible change without having to use enforcement. So some of the examples include, we've had some platforms change the terms of conditions to include more forms of harmful content. Some platforms have put in place really new and robust forms of age verification. Other platforms have created dedicated user reporting channels for the most severe and egregious harms, like child sexual abuse material. And all this has been able to be done through the lens of supervision rather than enforcement. Our preference is to use supervision wherever possible, but of course, when we see that there is a compliance issue and when platforms are not willing to cooperate, we will not hesitate to use our really strong enforcement powers. The Online Safety Act provides enforcement powers to Ofcom up to issuing fines of 10% of global turnover. There's also senior manager liability, as well as other issues that we can take. I'm perhaps most excited, though, about our powers for transparency, and I think this is one that will have a really wide-ranging impact globally. The Online Safety Act requires that some of the largest and riskiest platforms are subset to an additional set of requirements around transparency reporting. What this means is that my team at Ofcom can tell a platform that they must publish certain types of information, and then based on those reports that platforms publish, Ofcom will then publish reports making sense of it, comparing different platforms, aligning on what best practices are. We can cover transparency reporting issues related to the prevalence of harmful content, about how platforms are dealing with a certain type of harm, how they might approach something. And this is where I think that we will see a lot of meaningful change. Our theory of change when it comes to transparency reporting is that platforms are all beholden to different types of stakeholders. And there are stakeholders that might have financial interests, such as investors, advertisers, but also interests from employees and users. And the more information that we can put out there to the public, the more we think we can empower those stakeholders to work with us to push for change on those platforms that they use. Now, I'm going to end by talking a little bit more about international and domestic cooperation. The people here in this room have years and years of experience in child safety and online safety issues, and it's so important that we work together. We know that we cannot do this alone as Ofcom. We must work with governments, with regulators, with civil society organizations, researchers, academics, you name it, in order to share our evidence base on the way harms manifest online, as well as the best ways to address those harms. We need to work with our domestic counterparts in the UK because there are a number of other regulators who are looking at the same types of platforms. And it's important that we do a joined-up approach and we share best practices. So in the UK, we have the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, which bring together regulators for online safety, data protection, competition, and finance. And together, we think about how we have a joined-up approach to regulating some of the similar platforms that we all work with. This is particularly important for cross-cutting issues, such as artificial intelligence. But internationally is just as important as domestic partnerships. Our goal is to have international regulatory coherence. And that's really important because we think that that will reduce gaps in user safety, but it will also bring down compliance costs for companies. The reason why bringing down compliance cost is important for us is that we think that if the compliance costs are reduced and there's more regulatory cohesion, the same platforms who we are all worried about will be more likely to follow those rules, but will also ensure that we are not inadvertently stifling innovation and competition. So with that, I wanted to stop by talking about how we can work together really practically. I mentioned we have a number of consultations and draft proposals that are open. I urge you to please engage with them, to read them, to comment, to give your feedback to us, to tell us what we've got right, where we've gone wrong. The Online Safety Act has empowered Ofcom to be able to take an iterative approach, which means once we publish our first set of proposals, we can still iterate on them. And this is important because it means that we will be reflecting the latest in technology and the latest in the way that harms manifest online. And together, I think that we can work as an international community to come together to solve some of these unbelievably pressing problems. I'm so excited to be able to have the opportunity to learn from all of you today, to hear your experiences, your reflections, and I hope to be able to bring those back to London with me and share it with the team. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here today, and looking forward to hearing your questions. Obrigada.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessica, for your really thoughtful and inspiring speech. And of course, your experience is very, very rich and help us a lot to go deeper in many different questions. Perhaps I will now switch to Portuguese to have a more direct dialogue with the audience, if you don't mind. Yeah, you have translations. Do you have headphones? Can we? Perfect. Excellent. So now I'm going to do a first round of questions for our dialogue, and then I will open for the questions from the audience. I think I have around 3 or 4 there. Is it working? Yeah? Okay. So, muito obrigado mais uma vez, Jéssica, pela sua inspiradora e brilhante exposição. Você trocou em vários pontos que são pontos de preocupações comuns no debate brasileiro. Aqui no Brasil, a gente ainda não tem uma lei aprovada com o escopo da UK Online Safety Bill. Nós temos o Marco Civil da Internet, the Civil Rights Framework, que é uma lei que foi aprovada em 2014, e temos a Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados. E existem várias propostas em tramitação no Congresso para estabelecer novas regras em relação ao uso da inteligência artificial, sobretudo a partir de uma visão de riscos e impactos que a inteligência artificial pode causar, inclusive para crianças e adolescentes, e também um projeto de lei prevendo a regulação de plataformas. E desses projetos, um aspecto que salta aos olhos, eu queria te ouvir um pouco mais sobre isso, é a questão da jurisdição. Existem, como você mencionou, if I understood correctly, you mentioned 100,000 different services and platforms. E, claro, dessas 100 mil empresas que operam na rede, nem todas têm sede, escritório ou representante legal no Reino Unido. De que modo vocês estão lidando com esses temas jurisdicionais, quando você tem uma empresa que tem sede no exterior e oferta serviços, presta serviços para usuários no Reino Unido? Essa seria uma primeira pergunta. E de que maneira isso impacta os mecanismos de risk assessment previstos no UK Online Safety Bill?
Can you hear me? Okay. Great question. It's jurisdictional questions is definitely one that I anticipate we will learn a lot more once we actually start regulating and enforcing these rules. What I will say so far, though, is that a couple things. We have a really big team within our supervision function that is set up in order to try to promote compliance. And this is particularly for the more small or medium-sized companies that may not even know that they are subject to these regulatory requirements. And so we're working on ways to automize things like
self-service portals for you to go onto a website and to be able to click through and answer some questions to understand what you need to do specifically. Because we know that a lot of small companies will not have any experience working in online safety, and so we're creating really dedicated tools to help them in a very sort of self-service way. And that's for what we call sort of the smaller, medium-sized companies where we might not have a one-to-one supervisory relationship. For the large companies and the ones that are the highest risk, that's why we have this dedicated supervision team that is going out and building those relationships proactively. The fact that they don't necessarily have a UK presence so far hasn't been an issue for us because we are proactively reaching out to them. We're having collaborative discussions with them. We're doing regular visits to the US, to Singapore, to other parts of the world to go meet and have face-to-face conversations with those companies. One of the things that I've seen as quite promising, actually, is an example with our work to regulate video sharing platforms. So I mentioned before, let's take OnlyFans, which we regulate. During the last few years, we've worked with them to put in place age verification because of the rules that they are subject to in the UK. However, they've put in place age verification globally as well. And I think that that is one of the things that we're uniquely aware of, that when we make changes to platforms based on UK rules, we often see that those platforms make those changes globally, which means that having regulatory coherence and ensuring that we are working with other regulators to have joined up approaches. Our international team likes to say that we want to collaborate where possible, but diverge where necessary. But I think that the rubber will hit the road when we actually get to enforcing these rules and where I imagine we'll see more challenges. But you mentioned risk assessments. It doesn't matter where the company is based. Every company that is regulated, no matter if you're a one-person shop or you're the size of a Meta or an X, you have to do those risk assessments. And failure to do those risk assessments will mean we could take enforcement action.
Excellent. Um outro takeaway da sua fala se refere a esse diálogo permanente que a Ofcom mantém com os players da indústria, não só oferecendo guidance e guidelines, mas também pedindo contribuições e colaboração na implementação das recomendações e feedback sobre as propostas que serão editadas. Essa prática de transparência ativa, ela me parece absolutamente saudável e fundamental, e ela se alinha a um dos preceitos estabelecidos na Constituição brasileira, que estabelece o princípio da publicidade como regra para o setor público. Eu queria uma avaliação sua sobre como tem sido as contribuições, como você avalia o engajamento e as contribuições das empresas durante esse processo. Eles estão, na sua maioria, mais interessados em efetivamente colaborar com o processo ou em bloquear o processo?
I think with probably no surprise, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have seen that there have been some platforms who genuinely really want to engage, and they know that if they engage well with us, these rules are going to happen. They're already in place, and I think for some platforms, they know that their best bet is to work with us to make sure that we have proposals that are technologically sound and feasible. And those platforms have been really helpful. They've provided very, very substantive feedback to our draft consultations. But even outside of the formal channels of providing feedback to our consultations, we've had many different types of sessions with platforms where they will do deep dives or teach-ins with our team to help us understand the functionalities or the technology behind it. And one of the ways that I think has been very useful is when you get beyond the public policy teams, when you actually get to talk to the engineers, to the product managers, to the people who are building those products. That's where you get to the really interesting, to the heart of what these proposals need to be doing. That hasn't always been the case, of course, and I think that platforms who are not interested in engaging with Ofcom will probably see the pain down the end when they don't like the proposals that we're then enforcing against them. One other area that we've been kind of uniquely aware of, though, is this idea of sort of managing regulatory burden. So I mentioned just Ofcom alone, in online safety, we have 40 plus codes of practices and guidance. The International Commission Office, which does data privacy and security, the Competition Markets Authority, all of these UK regulators are also issuing guidance. The DSA is issuing guidance. We're very aware that we need to be proportionate in what we expect platforms to be able to do, and that is something that we're taking into account and in terms of our timeline and why we have spread things out, because we do think that we need to be fair and to allow platforms the opportunity to comment and provide input, but also in a really proportionate way.
Perfect. And now I will open for the questions from the floor. Tem as perguntas já no papel? Ah, perfeito. Do YouTube? Perfeito. Então vamos começar pela pergunta do YouTube.
A gente tem uma pergunta.
Chega também.
Ok, deixa eu passar o papel aqui. Jéssica, muito obrigada por aceitar estar aqui conosco hoje. É uma honra contar com a nossa primeira Keynote internacional. Eu tenho uma pergunta aqui do YouTube, questionando como foi a abordagem com as empresas para ver, de fato, a participação delas nessa temática e como está sendo essa implementação das regras no mundo corporativo. As outras duas estão com o Tiago.
Perfeito. Existem duas perguntas aqui, uma da Maria, do Alana, que está aqui. Como você avalia a relação com a discussão de direitos por design, safety by design, especialmente em relação a age assurance? Esse é um tema muito relevante aqui no Brasil também. Nós também estamos nos perguntando nos fazendo as mesmas perguntas, sobretudo agora no contexto em que as empresas de gambling, de jogos, elas estão passando por uma fase de regulamentação no mercado brasileiro. Eu sei que o mercado britânico já é regulado há bastante tempo, e há necessidade de se garantir que essa regulação que proíbe a utilizar os jogos, plataformas de jogos por criança e adolescente seja respeitada. Mas como garantir que aquele usuário, no final, não é um dog, um cachorro, como aquela charge do New York Times na década de 90, e sim um adulto capaz de tomar decisões informadas e conscientes. E a segunda pergunta could you please share more about online child labor and commercial exploitation as new kinds of harms affecting child well-being due to some design features? These questions come from Alana Institute as well.
Can you repeat the last question?
I think this question is related to children involved with creation of content and in monetization of content on social media.
So I'll take the two questions at the end about kids together. And the first question, I think, was sort of about how we promote engagement and compliance. I think the question was specific to YouTube, but I think I'll just take a maybe broader approach because we don't have necessarily a YouTube-specific approach. In general, with some of the largest and riskiest platforms I mentioned, we'll be proactively supervising them. So in some cases, actually, this has been really helpful to actually recruit people from tech companies themselves. So like myself, I used to work in the tech industry. We have a number of other people on our team who've come from platforms like Twitter and YouTube, Microsoft, and so forth, and they can really help us get under the skin and understand how organizations are structured and better understand how we can get through to them and communicate. But this is really where our supervision function is meant to be addressing compliance and promoting those new rules. We're having these supervisory conversations where we're meeting sometimes as much as once every other week, and we're sitting down with those companies and telling them this is what we expect you to be doing. If there are new risks that come up, such as over the summer, some of you may have seen that there were some violent riots that started through misinformation online on social media in the UK that ended up spreading into widespread violence and threats to different ethnic minority groups. In those kinds of cases, we picked up the phone and we proactively reached out to those platforms and we asked them what are they doing to address those risks, understand their response, and then encourage them to change things or make improvements where possible. So this is just an example, but also we've not hesitated to take enforcement action where we have seen really clear issues of compliance. Under the video sharing platform rules that I mentioned before, we've already opened several cases for enforcement against TikTok and OnlyFans due to different breaches related to how they share information with the regulator. We've also taken enforcement action on small adult platforms for failure to put in place robust forms of age verification. So switching to age verification now, this is a really difficult one, and in part because the technology is still developing. And this is also why, again, going back to the importance of collaboration, we have to be working hand in hand with those technology providers, with researchers, to ensure that our policy proposals are reflective of our understanding of how this works in practice. And I think age verification in particular is one of those areas that is most live in terms of most subject to changes and improvements. The Online Safety Act basically requires that platforms need to have, ensure that children have an age-appropriate experience. So it means that those experiences need to be uniquely tailored to those harms and to the risks that children might face. So this means, in terms of safety by design, for example, when it comes to something that might be a legal issue that should be permissible for adults, for kids, recommender algorithms should not be permitted to be pushing that kind of content to children. But in order to do that, going back to the presentation, the platforms need to know who the children are in the first place. They don't need to know the identity, but they need to be able to know, is this user above 18, below 18, are they below 13? In many cases, platforms don't allow under 13s to access it at all. So the age assurance in that example is meant to ensure that those children don't even access the platform at all. But for age 13 to 18, generally speaking, those platforms need to be tailoring the experience so the children have an age-appropriate experience. And then there was a question related to ID verification as well. So connecting to age assurance, I mentioned there's not a requirement to verify ID when it comes to age assurance. But when it comes to preventing certain issues like fraudulent advertising, robust ID checks and know your customer checks are the kinds of things that we'll be thinking about to ensure that there is more authenticity. This will also be really key for mitigating against harms such as foreign interference. And then lastly, in the third phase of regulatory implementation I mentioned for the largest services, adult users will be given the option to be able to verify their identity in order to be able to then decide if they want to filter out content from non-verified users. So there's a few ways in which we'll be thinking about identification across this regime.
Excelente. Tem mais uma pergunta aqui muito relevante sobre media literacy. Uma pergunta da Daniela Machado, do Instituto Palavra Aberta. A Ofcom tem há anos promovido esforços de educação midiática. Como essa área fica no contexto do UK Online Safety?
Great question. Media literacy is so important. It is incredibly useful in so many different contexts, but particularly in trying to prevent the spread of misinformation. So Ofcom has had powers in media literacy for the last 20 or so years, but of course that has evolved tremendously as more of the ways that media literacy becomes more relevant has increasingly moved to online platforms. So we've actually just published a new strategy that looks ahead for the next 3 years on media literacy. And what we'll be doing is building on our practice in media literacy in terms of building up research to understand how people make sense of media online, their experiences. I think one of the most interesting stats that we learned in the last year is that for the first time, people consume news in the UK more on online services than they do anywhere else, which really speaks volumes to the importance of media literacy campaigns and working with digital platforms. Our work includes working hand in hand with some of the biggest platforms to ensure that we are delivering media literacy content together. And part of what we do is try to provide and promote best practice principles for any organizations who are trying to do media literacy initiatives. The strategy that we just published kind of has three key components. The first is a focus on research, evidence, and evaluation. The second is our work with the tech companies I mentioned already, because they are so key in delivering those media literacy campaigns. And then finally, a focus on people and partnerships, and that's because at the heart of media literacy is people, and we want to ensure that as we're promoting media literacy, we're doing so with those really trusted organizations that will be able to get through to those communities.
Excelente. Mais duas perguntas para a gente concluir. Uma em relação o Online Safety, o UK Online Safety Bill, ele não trouxe provisões em relação ao acesso a dados por pesquisadores. Como vocês enxergam a evolução desse framework regulatório e a relevância do acesso a alguns dados que são custodiados pelas plataformas para que pesquisadores possam realizar pesquisas independentes e produzir evidências sobre situações de harms no escopo, riscos e harms no escopo da lei, e também como é a interação da Ofcom com canais de denúncia, com os hotlines. O IWF, por exemplo, é o primeiro hotline europeu, existe desde 1996. Se essa interação com outros canais de denúncia que trabalham coletando evidências sobre conteúdos ilegais e que podem causar danos para crianças, ela é relevante para os trabalhos desenvolvidos pela Ofcom.
I'll start with the last one first. I don't know that we have any specific dedicated channels, but I'll have to go back and double check with my team on that. But I will say that just in general, we welcome input from basically any stakeholders who have information that they can provide to us, and we have secure kind of communication channels for where there are risks around identity and privacy for those kinds of things. But on the previous question about researcher access, I'm so glad whoever asked that. Very timely. Next week, actually, my team is going to be publishing a call for evidence on researcher access to data on platforms. So what we are going to be looking for is information from people about how this works today. What are the challenges? What are the things that should be improved? We're trying to gather information about just sort of the state of play on researcher access to data. What we'll then do with that information is in, I believe, summer of next year, my team is going to be publishing a report that summarizes what we've learned and put forward a set of sort of recommendations about how that can be improved. We really believe that researcher access to data is so critical. It connects very clearly to our goals around transparency reporting, being able to shine a light on good and best practices. But this is actually one of the areas of current political debate within the UK government about whether those provisions are in the right place. And I know that there's been a lot of interest in looking at the DSA's approach to researcher access to data, which is slightly different. But for anyone who is interested and passionate about this, please do engage with our call for evidence. It's going to be published next week.
Thank you. Jessica, now you have the floor for your final remarks. We are just concluding our session, so feel free to use the time you need for your final remarks.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank you all so much for the invitation to speak with you all. I'm so honored to be the first person from outside Brazil to speak with you all. I'm really, really keen to learn from you. I want to be able to share these experiences and your expertise with my team when I go back to London. And a big thank you for the huge warm welcome to all of you. It's my first time in Brazil. It's been a wonderful experience so far, so thank you so much for having me, and please come find me during the conference. I'd love to meet you all.
Muitíssimo obrigado. Nós tivemos uma sessão realmente muito inspiradora. A Jéssica, ela, com muita generosidade, com profundidade, ela compartilhou parte da experiência do Reino Unido na regulação desses temas. Destaco novamente 350 pessoas alocadas na Ofcom para a implementação do online Safety Bill. É um número impressionante e não à toa que a Ofcom é considerada uma lighthouse, não apenas aqui no Brasil, mas em boa parte do mundo. Muitíssimo obrigado, Jéssica, e espero que você tenha um ótimo dia de evento, com diálogos com diversos representantes de instituições que estão aqui, instituições, e que você possa levar boas memórias da sua experiência no Brasil, em São Paulo, e que você retorne mais vezes a São Paulo e a outras cidades brasileiras, para que a gente possa continuar aprofundando esse debate assim que possível. Muitíssimo obrigado. Thank you so much.